When you think about concepts like participatory governance, where citizens are actually stakeholders in the state, it feels quite modern, doesn't it?
It really does. The default setting in our minds is, well, Enlightenment, Europe, parliaments, constitutions.
Exactly, like the 18th century onwards. Before that, we tend to picture um, absolute rulers, right? Monarchs, emperors, chiefs,
Yeah.
just top-down command.
That's the common narrative. But the sources we're digging into today, they paint a very different picture.
A pretty stunning picture, actually. Long before those European revolutions, the state set up in Medina, it seems to have had this, well, vibrant institutional model. Citizens weren't passive.
Not at all. They were active participants, woven right into the decision-making, you could say.
And what we're looking at here is not just nice ethical ideas, is it? It looks like a conscious design.
Absolutely. An institutional design. It deliberately pushed for systematic representation. It formalized how power was delegated.
And demanded accountability.
Unyielding accountability from officials, yes.
Yeah.
And maybe the most radical part, it framed leadership fundamentally as a service, not a privilege, not a birthright.
Service, not privilege. That's the core takeaway we're exploring. So, welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we covered cases 1 to 6. That was the constitutional bedrock.
Yeah.
Liberty, rule of law, the duty to consult, shura.
The foundational principles.
Right. Today, we're building on that. We're diving into cases 7 through 15. And our focus is squarely on the machinery, political representation and civic participation. How did it work in practice?
We're looking for those operational blueprints.
Right.
How was leadership set up as this heavy responsibility, a service owed to the community? We need to see the mechanisms.
Yeah, moving beyond the philosophy to the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
How powers were defined, who got picked for jobs, how the whole thing was kept, well, honest and focused on the public good.
Exactly. From theory to the tangible day-to-day workings of the state.
Okay, let's start unpacking the basics of inclusion. Case 7 talks about the political representation framework. What was so different about how this state handled representation compared to others at the time?
Well, the big shift was making civic engagement systematic, institutionalized. It went way beyond just getting informal advice from your buddies.
So like formal channels.
Exactly. Formal codified channels to make sure that community members, and this is key, across the entire spectrum had a structured way to have their voice heard in decisions that mattered to them.
And this wasn't just about making smarter decisions, was it?
No, I mean, that was part of it, but it was also fundamentally about legitimacy, stability, getting that broad buy-in from the community.
And the sources emphasize something quite striking, that no one was excluded.
Yeah.
That feels radical even now. It means going beyond the usual power players.
Precisely. The design itself codified inclusivity. It wasn't just a system for the main group in charge.
So who else was included?
Well, you had the traditional figures like tribal leaders. They were integrated into the consultation process. But then you also had minority groups.
Like the Jewish tribes in Medina.
Yes, famously. Under the Constitution of Medina, they had defined channels. They could bring forward concerns, grievances, input about their rights, their responsibilities within the whole political setup.
Okay, but what about groups usually left out of politics? Women, for example.
Right.
Was their role just symbolic, or did they have actual institutional avenues?
It seems their inclusion was structurally pretty significant. Take the Oath of Allegiance, the Bay'ah. That was the core political contract, right?
Between the citizen and the leader, yeah.
Sources clearly show women taking that oath independently, making that political commitment on their own behalf.
Interesting. Any other avenues?
Yes, things like direct petition rights, formal participation in assemblies, especially when discussing issues like domestic matters or social laws. It wasn't just about being socially present. It acknowledged their political agency.
So the system basically said political standing came from citizenship, not your gender or family tree.
That seems to be the implication. It codified that principle.
So, stepping back, what does this representation framework tell us about the state's overall intention? Structurally speaking.
It tells us the founders got it. They understood that having only one viewpoint makes for brittle government. This framework, it's really a blueprint for what we see in successful modern representative democracy.
How so?
Well, if any modern state, especially one with lots of different groups, wants to work well and, peacefully, it needs these kinds of codified, systematic ways for everyone to have input. Case 7 shows this system was built deliberately to capture that whole spectrum of opinions and interests.
Because a wider base of information and legitimacy makes the whole structure stronger.
Exactly. It strengthens the entire governing body.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But let's be real. You can have great representation, but if all the actual power stays locked at the very top...
Then those representative voices are just for show. Window dressing.
Right. Which leads us straight into Case 8, the delegation of authority framework. This is about how power was actually distributed.
A crucial structural point, absolutely. Case 8 laid down clear principles, systematic procedures for spreading power and responsibility across the state as it grew. They knew a single central authority couldn't possibly manage everything efficiently.
The sources talk about governors and envoys being appointed. Now, sending a governor to a faraway province back then, that sounds incredibly risky. How do they stop these guys from just becoming mini-kings in their own territories?
That was the challenge. The key was that delegation wasn't just a go forth and govern kind of thing. It came with clear written limits and oversight mechanisms.
So delegation didn't mean losing control.
Not at all. It wasn't abdication. Governors, for instance, got written mandates. These spelled out their specific powers: judicial, financial, administrative. They had to file financial reports, which stopped them from running things like personal piggy banks.
And Medina kept tabs on them.
Yes, the central authority kept the right to do periodic inspections and, importantly, could recall them quickly if needed. It created this working balance. Enough regional autonomy for efficiency, but not so much that you get unchecked power consolidating out there.
So connecting this to modern government structures, where do we see the echoes of this framework?
Oh, it's the direct ancestor of almost every effective system of decentralized governance we have today. Think about federal systems, right?
Where states or provinces have their own powers but still answer to a central government.
Precisely. Like managing local schools or police, but still following national laws and reporting their finances. It's also the basis for ministerial systems.
Like cabinet ministers with specific jobs, foreign affairs, finance, etc.
Exactly. Each with a clearly defined and therefore limited area of responsibility. The big lesson from Case 8 is that delegated governance keeps power spread out, manageable, and crucially, accountable. It locks in the idea that authority is, well, loaned out and has to be used within strict published rules.
All right, so we have frameworks for who gets a voice and how power is spread out. The next big piece is who actually gets to hold that power. Which brings us to Section 2, focusing on the integrity of the people involved. Let's kick off with Case 9, Public Office Qualification Standards.
Case 9 is really quite something. It's basically a direct hit against the old aristocratic idea, rule by the best families. Instead, it set up a system based strictly on merit for appointments.
Strictly merit, in a society that was still very tribal.
Yes. The core criteria for getting a public job, whether you were going to be a governor, a general, or a judge, were competence and integrity. Your family name, your tribe's influence, how much money you had, all that was explicitly secondary to whether you could actually do the job well and honestly.
That's a huge change. I mean, you're challenging powerful families, established hierarchies. How did they make sure this merit system wasn't just nice talk? How did they deal with the political pushback from clans wanting their own people in?
Well, it seems they did it through a very conscious institutional practice. They made people demonstrate capability first. Appointments rarely went to untested people.
So you had to prove yourself.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
When choosing officials, the sources show they preferred people who had already shown their knowledge, their administrative skills, or their ethical strength, in public life. This made it harder for rivals to argue against a merit-based appointment because the community already recognized the person's qualifications.
Could you give us a specific example? Someone appointed for skill over status.
A classic example is Mu'adh ibn Jabal. He was young, not some senior tribal figure, but he had deep knowledge of law, great diplomatic skills, persuasive speaker.
And he got a significant posting.
Yes, he was appointed as an envoy and governor to Yemen, a really complex place, strategically and politically. The choice was based entirely on his qualifications and character. It was like a professional deployment, based on assessing his merit. He was picked to be a judge and administrator specifically because he had the intellectual and ethical chops for it.
That focus on capability, It really does sound like the ancestor of modern professional standards.
Absolutely. It's the historical root of the professional civil service idea. A government that puts merit first is more efficient, it maintains standards, and it cuts down massively on the risk of, cronyism and corruption just taking over.
Case 9 basically said the long-term health of the state matters more than pleasing powerful people in the short term.
That's the core message. Institutional capacity trumps political convenience.
Okay, so you've got merit-based selection. But how do you ensure consistency over time? How do you hold people accountable later? That leads us to Case 10, administrative record-keeping standards. Sounds a bit dry, maybe?
It might sound procedural, but honestly, without it, the whole system of merit and delegation just falls apart.
Oh.
Without systematic records, a state has no memory. It can't enforce past decisions. It loses transparency. Case 10 made rigorous archiving, creating, and keeping state records a core, non-negotiable government function. That was pretty revolutionary in the 7th century, when so much was still based on oral agreements and memory.
What kinds of things were they actually writing down and keeping?
Yeah.
Why that level of detail?
We see meticulous records of stuff vital for how the state worked, both inside and out. Things like official letters.
To other rulers?
Yeah, letters sent to foreign leaders, Byzantines, Persians, tribal chiefs to keep a diplomatic history. Records of treaties and agreements, which define the state's borders and political relationships. And, really importantly, financial records.
Tax documents.
Specifically tax registers and rolls. These established the state's financial legitimacy and allowed oversight of those provincial tax collectors we mentioned. Having these records meant the state wasn't constantly starting from scratch. Its institutional memory was solid and accessible.
And these records are what make the accountability you talked about in Case 9 actually possible, right?
Yeah.
You need the paper trail.
Precisely. This is the historical foundation for modern state archives, for that whole concept of institutional memory that outlasts any single leader. And it lays the groundwork for transparency laws, too. If the records exist, they can be looked at by citizens, by future leaders checking precedents.
Records turn talk into policy, and policy into something you can actually check.
Into auditable fact.
Yes, and having auditable facts brings us, quite dramatically, to Case 11, the Public Servant Accountability Mechanism. This is where the rubber meets the road on ethics, isn't it? Zero tolerance for corruption.
Absolutely. This mechanism made it crystal clear. Officials holding public trust were held strictly, relentlessly accountable for any misuse of power, any conflict of interest, any corruption. Didn't matter who they were, how high up, or who they knew. The system was designed to shut down impunity at every level.
This is where we need that specific story, the one that really drives home how this was established.
Right. The crucial anecdote involves a tax collector named Ibn al-Adbiya. He was sent out to collect the zakat, the charity tax, from a tribe. When he got back to Medina, he presented the funds.
Okay.
So he hands over the money due to the treasury, but then he puts another pile of goods to the side. And he says, essentially, this part is for the state, and this other part, well, this was given to me personally as a gift, for doing a good job.
He saw it as a kind of performance bonus, a legitimate private perk.
Exactly. He thought it was fine. But the prophet publicly, immediately, and decisively shut that down. He stood up and gave this, quite searing address to everyone. He asked rhetorically, why doesn't one of them just sit at home and see if anyone brings some gifts there?
Oof, that cuts right to the heart of it. The gifts only came because he had state power behind him.
Precisely. The conflict of interest was blatant, and the ruling was severe and immediate. Anything you receive while doing a public job belongs entirely to the public treasury, full stop.
Wow. So codified that public office isn't a platform for getting rich.
It defined the public servant's fiduciary duty. Your loyalty, your financial benefit, it all has to be tied exclusively to the state's interest, not your own pocket.
Was that just a one-time moral lesson, though? Or did it become standard practice? Do they set up ways to enforce this afterwards?
Oh, it became absolutely binding. It set the standard operating procedure for the caliphs who came later. That confrontation became the legal precedent.
So it led to actual systems.
Yes. Later caliphs institutionalized things like meal inspections, basically, audits. They'd send officials to check a governor's assets when they were appointed and again when they left office, specifically to see if they'd somehow enriched themselves unfairly. Case 11 set the fundamental ethical line, and later administrations built the enforcement machinery around it.
That zero-tolerance approach to corruption really provides the ethical spine for the state. Okay, let's shift perspective now and look at the rights the citizens themselves had within this whole system. Starting with Case 12, institutional transparency protocols.
Right. If accountability is about consequences, transparency is what builds public trust in the first place. Case 12 essentially codified the citizen's right to know. It established this clear institutional need for openness in government, a flat rejection of secret deals or closed-door decisions on things affecting the public.
How did that actually work back then, though? Openness in a 7th century administration. What kind of government actions specifically required public disclosure?
The sources are pretty clear on this. Transparency was required for the big stuff decisions that put citizens at risk or fundamentally changed their legal status.
Like going to war.
Exactly. Major decisions about war, calling people to fight or deciding to stand down, and crucially, making public the details of treaties signed with other groups or nations.
What was the thinking behind that?
The logic was straightforward. These decisions directly hit people's lives, their safety, their property. So the state had an ethical and political duty to tell them what was happening completely and openly.
So it's more than just keeping people informed. It's an institutional check on power.
Absolutely. It aligns perfectly with the principles behind modern freedom of information laws, or FOI laws. Case 12 underlines a basic truth. An informed public isn't just nice to have for good governance, it's essential for it.
Because people need to know what the government's doing if they're expected to participate, follow the law, and hold leaders accountable.
Exactly. Transparency legitimizes the state's actions. It also helps kill rumors and suspicion before they fester.
Okay, shifting back to selecting the people at the very top, Case 13 looks at leadership selection criteria. We heard about merit for officials, but what about the absolute top leaders? What were the non-negotiables there?
For the senior leaders, the ones holding the community's ultimate trust, like the main commander or the successor of the criteria boiled down to two interconnected pillars.
Which were?
Proven piety, which really meant deep ethical character, a commitment to justice, and demonstrated capability or competence. You needed both.
Why both? Why wasn't one enough?
Well, this dual standard avoids two massive pitfalls. You don't want a brilliant strategist who's completely unethical, right? But you also don't want a really good, honest person who's just incapable of handling complex duties. Both were seen as mandatory. You needed the character and the skill.
And there's a great example of a leader whose reputation really captured this duality.
Yes, absolutely. The selection and the reputation of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. He was widely known, almost universally, as the Amin of this ummah, the trustee or the custodian of the nation. That title itself embodies what Case 13 is talking about. He was given the highest level of public trust because everyone knew his character, his dedication to justice, and his competence in military and administrative matters were all beyond question. The whole community felt secure with him in charge.
That kind of deep trust, it's still the most valuable thing in leadership today, isn't it?
It's the very currency of legitimate government. And this criteria links straight to constitutional standards all over the world. When a top leader fails, whether it's corruption or a moral lapse or just incompetence, they've violated exactly this dual standard: ethical integrity and professional capability. Case 13 demands that the highest positions go to those who are both the most trustworthy and the most qualified.
Makes sense. Now, Case 14 tackles another vital democratic idea: governance diversity protection. We touched on including different voices earlier. How did this state make sure that diversity was actively protected within the decision-making structures themselves?
This is actually a remarkable part of the model. It shows a real institutional commitment to plurality. The governance structure didn't just tolerate difference, it demanded explicit structural inclusion in the bodies that made decisions.
So it wasn't just passive tolerance.
No, it was proactive. The prophetic model actively protected diverse voices and made sure there was representation at different levels. It recognized that a successful state has to manage diversity, not try to squash it or pretend it doesn't exist.
Can you give specifics on that structural inclusion? Who exactly was being protected in this diverse setup?
You see it working on a couple of levels. First, the inclusion of non-Muslim communities. We mentioned the Jewish tribes under the Constitution of Medina. That document set them up as a distinct political group, a separate ummah, actually with clearly defined rights and responsibilities.
Including political rights.
Yes, things like political recourse, even military defense duties. They weren't just subjects, they were like political parties within the wider state structure. Then, second, you see how internal political dynamics were managed. The two main Muslim groups at the time, the Ansar, the locals in Medina, and the Muhajirun, immigrants from Mecca, there was a consistent effort to balance their representation in councils and top positions.
Why was that balancing act so important?
It was critical for managing the internal coalition, politically speaking. It ensured that neither group could just steamroll the other and dictate policy without getting input and consent.
That sounds incredibly similar to how modern systems try to guarantee seats for minorities or ensure regional balance in a cabinet.
It's a clear historical precedent. It shows the state was deliberately designed to stop any single group, even the biggest one, from becoming too dominant and undermining the government's legitimacy by excluding others. This institutional commitment to diversity, it's a timeless lesson for protecting minority rights in parliaments and decision-making bodies everywhere today.
Okay, finally we land on Case 15, the Civic Participation Framework. We started out talking about citizens being active stakeholders. How was their participation formalized beyond just having representatives?
Case 15 really formalized the expectation that citizens were actively encouraged to participate, that they were emphatically not ruled in silence. The framework made sure that consultation, shura, wasn't just an optional suggestion box people could ignore.
It was required.
It was a required part of governance, and it fundamentally shaped major policy decisions. It institutionalized public involvement.
We need a concrete example here. Where can we see community feedback really making a difference?
The classic crucial example is the consultation and the public reaction around the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. This was a hugely tense moment.
What happened?
The treaty they negotiated had terms that many of the companions felt were just humiliating, a betrayal of everything they stood for. They were incredibly upset emotionally and politically.
But so did the leadership just ignore that, say, tough, this is the deal?
Not at all. That immediate, intense feedback from the community, their open questioning, their strong reactions, it directly shaped how the treaty decision was implemented and eventually understood.
So the initial decision stood, but the process changed.
The leader initially held firm on the strategic necessity of the treaty, yes. But dealing with that deep sense of grievance required patient, ongoing engagement with the community. Their participation, their vocal disagreement even, ensured that the decision, even though it was unpopular at first, eventually gained legitimacy. Why? Because the citizens were involved in wrestling with why it was necessary.
It validated their role, not just as receivers of policy, but
As co-creators of the policy's legitimacy, yes, even if they didn't initially like the policy itself.
that really underlines the idea that even when tough strategic calls are needed, engaging the community is vital for the long-term success of that decision.
Absolutely. And it links straight to modern ideas about public participation in policymaking. Think about public forums, town halls, participatory budgeting, where citizens actually help decide how public money is spent. Case 15 grounds the idea that state decisions really only get legitimacy and lasting power through active, institutionally encouraged, and respectful give and take with the citizens. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. This has been an incredibly detailed look into the actual workings of this early state. Just to quickly recap what the sources seem to show through cases 7 to 15. We've pulled out 6 foundational principles about that relationship between the state and the citizen. First, representation wasn't a favor, it was a civic right for everyone. Formal channels were set up to make sure no voice, regardless of status, gender, was just systematically ignored.
Second, delegation of power was key for efficiency and decentralization. But, and this is crucial, it came with mandatory accountability and clear written limits. No creating little tyrants out in the provinces.
Third, leadership selection was strictly based on merit, actual competence and integrity. Capability trumped status or family ties. A fundamental rejection of aristocracy.
Fourth, transparency and careful record-keeping weren't optional extras. They were core government duties. This guaranteed institutional memory and provided the essential paper trail for audits and accountability.
Fifth, governance was built on diversity and inclusion. It wasn't just tolerated, it was structurally protected, proactively balancing different political groups and safeguarding minority rights.
And finally, sixth, civic participation was baked in as a constitutional principle. Citizens were actively consulted, never just ruled over in silence. Their role as stakeholders was validated.
So, looking at these 9 cases, cases 7 through 15 altogether, what's the single core insight you really want listeners to take away from this?
I think the core insight is that this prophetic model, through these specific cases, gives us a clear, practical blueprint for participatory governance. And it's built on an ethic of service.
A system designed to resist autocracy.
Emphatically. By deliberately diffusing power, by institutionalizing systematic accountability for everyone in office, and by demanding radical transparency from the very top. These aren't just interesting historical footnotes. They feel like timeless blueprints for achieving justice and ethical leadership. And frankly, they're profoundly relevant for any political system today that's grappling with corruption or representation or the dangers of centralized power.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it leads to a really important final question, doesn't it? If the standards were so clear, merit, transparency, accountability for every official, even down to the tax collector,
If they were so clearly defined and non-negotiable.
then what system was there to make sure the leaders themselves, the very top figures, actually follow the law? If the governor gets audited, who audits the head of state?
That really is the ultimate test, isn't it? Does the law apply equally to the ruler and the ruled? Is anyone truly above the law?
Which sets us up perfectly for our next deep dive. In our next session, we'll be tackling cases 16 through 23, shifting our focus entirely to judicial independence and the rule of law.
We'll explore how impartial courts were set up, how the judicial process was kept separate from the political process.
And how the system actually managed to place even the most senior leaders and the state itself squarely under the authority of the law.
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. We look forward to having you join us for that vital conversation.